Hello and welcome everyone to our final webinar for the Fall Heifer Management webinar series with the Heifer Academy. I would like to introduce Diego Manriquez Alvarez, and he's going to be talking about optimizing hutch microenvironments for pre-weaned heifers, management considerations, and animal stress responses. So first, we're going to learn a little bit about Dr. Manriquez. So I'm delighted to introduce him as today's featured speaker. Dr. Manriquez is a leading researcher in the health performance of dairy cattle, serving as a dairy systems specialist at AgNext with Colorado State University. After obtaining a DVM degree from the University of Concepcion of Chile, Dr. Manriquez earned his PhD at Colorado State University in Animal Sciences. And it was great because we did share a lab at one time. So Diego and I know each other from our grad school days. His research focuses on the development of early detection of disease strategies and the integration of epidemiology, behavioral and metabolic and microbiome data to understand the impact of productive practices on dairy cattle performance, workers, and the environment. We are excited to have Dr. Manriquez with us today to talk about his work. Welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Cora. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here today. I hope this is a good start for the Thanksgiving week. So I'll try to be concise and hopefully you walk away with some practical information that can be useful to you. So today's title is Optimizing Hutch Microenvironment for Pre-weaned Heifers, especially regarding management consideration and animal stress responses. And when we say optimize, we need to be able to identify, first of all, the things we would like to optimize. And that decision needs to be based on data we can rely on, and then identify what are the nuances of those data and how we can modify the environment for our heifers. So today, let me just switch the slide. The outline for this presentation is going to be how we can use sensor data to assess calf microenvironment. And here we are going to define what we understand as a calf microenvironment. Also, we are going to talk about the work we are doing in terms of heat stress on pre-wean dairy heifers housed in hutches. And we're going to talk about what have been their behavioral responses we have used and other people have used to assess heat stress and heat stress conditions. Also, we're going to talk about some strategies we have assessed in terms of trying to reduce heat in the hatches, and also what are the animal stress responses that we usually use to measure how stressed the animals are, and also some new approaches we have been testing. And lastly, we are going to discuss some hatch design opportunities that we are considering. So with that, about the use of sensor data is really important because, as I was mentioning at the beginning of this presentation, if we want to optimize something, we need to measure what we want to optimize in an objective way. We can do that using sensor data, collecting data from the calf environment. And for that, we can use publicly available data. And from this data, it's really important that we consider what are the things that calf are exposed to in terms of what are the air composition and also some air quality considerations. So if we consider the components of the air is composed by gases, chemical, physical composition of the air is really important, particulates and microbes. For today's presentation, we are going to be talking about the physical composition of the air in terms of temperature, which is very obvious to talk about. Relative humidity is really important because it's going to affect the perception of temperature, and also it has a role in some of the air quality measurements. For example, high humidity elevates the perception of heat, also elevates the concentration of particulates in the air, and also is associated with ammonia. Wind is another physical component of the air in terms of ventilation, and solar radiation in terms of heat dissipation and heat accumulation. So as I mentioned a minute ago, there are some public sources where we can collect this data if we are, for example, a CAF branch manager and we want to know what is the most close description of our environment. We can go to several websites, but here I am providing this website, which is the one I use. So if you go to that website, is very handy. You can enter your location, then select which type of summary you want. Also select the data ranges, and there are a bunch of categories or variables you can collect. For example, here I just selected air temperature, and then you click OK, and you are shown all the weather stations that are nearby of your area. So you select the weather station you want to get data from, and then you just go like for a regular shopping cart, and you click add to cart, and then you are prompted to enter your email, and also you will be asked to select the way you prefer to receive the data. I usually do Excel spreadsheet, so I get the data in that format. It's really easy to use, so I recommend you all to take a look if you wanna see some data of your area. Now, we commonly use on-site data collection using a wide variety of sensors, and there are plenty of options in the market that could be used. My purpose is not to advertise any specific brands. I think there are very reliable sensors out of the market, all the way from a complete weather station like this one that has wind direction sensors and anemometers for wind speed. Also, this little black spot here is a solar radiation sensor, and we also have sensors for temperature and humidity. And this is really convenient because from this console, you can plug in your laptop and get data. And also you have options to download the data from your phone. And another important consideration is that this weather station usually have solar panels, so access to energy is not a problem. Also, we have used these little sensors, especially to be installed inside of the hatches, to measure the temperature and humidity of the center of the hatch. And also infrared thermometers can be used to measure, for example, wall temperature and also ground temperature. Some people have also used these sensors to measure the temperature from the skin of the animals. So as I was describing at the beginning of this presentation, it's really important to identify what are the challenges or the things we want to optimize, and then come up with reliable and objective ways to measure those challenges, and then describe it in a way it can make sense to us researchers, but also to producers, so that we can together develop some innovation. From this sustainability research cycle, we spend a lot of time here measuring and describing because there are a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of CAF microenvironment. So to start describing this CAF microenvironment, I'd like to divide all the components of this microenvironment in farm level measurements or farm level factors and animal level factors. So talking about farm level factors, of course, environmental conditions are important. Throughout the decades, temperature and relative humidity have played a huge role, and For example, the temperature and humidity index was developed back in 1971, and this index is widely used in the literature up to date. Generally, we consider threshold of THI above 78 to 72 units to be associated to heat stress responses. However, this single value is a little bit tricky to work with because we need to see if we are, for example, averaging the daily THI. Is that the threshold we are using? Are we more interested to use the maximum or maybe minimum? Can we use the THI or account how many units above certain threshold the calf have been exposed to see the accumulation of heat stress exposure? Also, can we take the difference, for example, between the maximum and the minimum THI exposure to see the fluctuation and how this affects calf health, cow behavior, and calf welfare? And in that regard, it's really important to make area evaluation of THI because a same value of THI, for example, a THI value of 80 in dry climate, for example, here in Colorado, we have a dry climate, we can reach that value of 80 with lower humidity. And as we know, humidity affects the perception of heat. On the other hand, THI value of 80 in Florida, for example, where it's more humid, we can reach that value with lower temperature, but with higher humidity. So we need to have those considerations. So here in this plot, we have data coming from Colorado, and here we observe a wide variability between the maximum and minimum THI, and this is true all across the year and across seasons. And here, especially in the cold season, we see a wide variability within each point, maximum or minimum. So that means that across all season, our dairy heifers could be exposed to heat stress conditions and also cold stress conditions all in the same date. Also, I think it's really important to look at thermal stress intensity. And this just means looking at maximum and minimum points. Here, for example, we have data of a calf being exposed to certain levels of THI during their first 7 days of life. For example, here, if we looked at maximum THI values, in average over the summer, that maximum values average was around 80 points, and in winter was about 58 units. And regarding the minimum, in the summer, that average was close to 53 units, and then it was very low over the winter. Another way we are looking at THI values is to calculate how many points after a certain threshold calf have been exposed within a certain period of time. So if we looked at the summer data during the first days of life, on average, these heifers are exposed to 57 points accumulated after a 68 THI threshold. And it's interesting over the winter if we decide to use THI as a cold stress indicator, which can be discussed because it wasn't specifically designed for heat stress, but we could still use it as a proxy of the effect of environmental exposure to cold. We see that during these first 7 days of life, the accumulated cold stress was 233 points. Also, we consider duration of thermal stress exposure to be an important player in the health and welfare of these animals. If we take these 7 days in hours, there are 168 hours, and if we observe how many hours of those hours these calves were exposed to thermal stress, In the summer, we observed that 46% of the time, calves were exposed to thresholds above 68 points of THI. On the other hand, in winter, if we have a THI threshold of 50, 92% of the time, calf were exposed to these levels under this threshold. So it could be a very significant in our climate in the West. Also, with all this technology, it's really important to study what are the hottest period of the day, not only for the sake of knowing, but also to know where it's more convenient or more impactful to do something. With our observation of farm level monitoring, we have determined that during summer, the hottest period of the day here in Colorado is between noon and 6 p.m. We have observed maximum THI value of 80.5 units and with an average of 74 points. In terms of temperature, that maximum temperature can reach 101 Fahrenheit degree, and in average, this was 94.5. Knowing this time period is important because we could optimize our water intake, for example, provide fresher water either before or during that time window, and also optimize feeding time, maybe prioritizing feeding younger animals before this period so they're all fed and they can just use their time to seek shade or trying to cool down. Also, the use of a strategic shade could be considered because the angle of which the sun is going to hit the hatches is going to impact the ways that heat is retained and also spread through the surface. And also, we could try to avoid handling during this time, especially disbudding or vaccination or any other activity. During the winter, we have also done this analysis, and we have observed that between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. is the coldest period of the day during winter, and here the average THI was 36 points, and the temperature was 32 Fahrenheit degrees. Now, if we consider hatch as a part of the microenvironment, we can also take measurements from it. As I was mentioning before, we have used this type of sensors to measure central air conditions in the hatches, and also we have taken wall measurements from it. Now, if we take into account the hatch measurements, within the hatch, during the summer, the period from noon to 6 p.m. was also the hottest period of the day during summer. And here the average THI was 77 units, and this was 3 units higher versus the environment. And in average, the temperature was 91 Fahrenheit degree, which tended to be lower to the environmental temperature. Knowing this period is also important because we can decide to open the ventilations in the hatches. Also, some producers, I have seen this, they lift the hatches to provide an extra opening. And we are not 100% sure that this helps. Probably, if we consider the thermodynamics of air, this does not improve the circulation of air, but visually it looks like you are doing something for calves that obviously look heat stress. And also, it's important to know this period of the day to consider our strategic shade. During the winter, we have also performed this analysis. Again, the coldest period of the day in the hatch was between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. And the THI average and temperature are this one. And here we found that in the hatch, the temperatures tend to be 0.8 degrees warmer than the environment. So we are very interested into measure hatch microenvironment and trying to find ways to overcome some of the challenges that we have found, and also challenges we have heard from the producers. And we think that it's really important to study what are the factors that are influencing heat generation, heat dissipation, and heat absorption. In terms of heat generation, of course, the source of heat in the hatch is going to be the calf. So it's important to consider the calf metabolic rate and the intake. Measuring this is important because it interacts with the hatch microenvironment. And we want to be able to measure, for example, the level of urine or feces and how this affects the generation of heat and with the interaction of bedding. Also, considering if we are using pair housing, we think that this management is becoming more common here in the West. It could have an effect in hatch microenvironments, and also, of course, the bedding management as a source of heat. We have seen that this changes between seasons, and this has implication, of course, in the heat generation, but also in calf health and behavior. In terms of heat dissipation is just another way of heat transfer. And there are three main ways in which heat gets transferred. And this is conduction. And this may have to do with how walls conduct heat and also with the hatch geometry. I'm going to show you some experiments we have been performing in terms of heat conduction. Convection has to do with the movement of air inside of the hatch. So ventilation is going to be an important factor to be studied. And radiation has to do with how the sun hit the wall of the hatch. In terms of conduction, we have been modeling the current hatch design in the computer and creating many iterations. So this one is the common hatch used in our calf yards. And here, even though this is preliminary, we are still working on this, we have seen that the geometry of the hatch, of the current hatch, is complex, and this affects the way that heat gets dissipated. As heat or energy finds different geometry, it tends to be trapped, and that reduces the potential of this heat to be transferred to neighbor molecules and get dissipated throughout the hatch. So that's an important consideration, and it could be used to start developing new housing systems. Convection, as I was saying before, it has to do with ventilation. And here we have two main parts to study ventilation. The first of them is how the air in the center of the hatch is moved. We have been simulating this in the computer, and we have observed that the main factor that triggers ventilation is the area either of the front door or the rear windows. And if this area is not enough, the ventilation is not going to be enough. Again, this data is preliminary, but we have observed that our current hatches do not perform well in terms of central air ventilation. Another important thing regarding ventilation is how air moves close to the walls of the hatch, because that's going to have an impact on how air is moved high and probably taking out some particles. We haven't done those iterations yet, but we think it's going to be an important factor to consider. In terms also of convection, it's important to think that the hatch is also interacting with the outside. And in this regard, it's important to know that the direction of wind is going to have an impact on how the air inside of the hatch gets moved out. And we have performed some experiment, and I apologize here for the handwriting, but with just these calculations on paper, we are collecting data of the wind direction in some operations, and we have observed that if we face the main entrance of the hatch uh, against the direction of the wind, we can reduce the air captivity index uh, down to 34%. That means that only 34% of the air gets inside of the hatch, so ventilation is improved. On the other hand, if we put the rear window against the direction of the wind, about 87% of the air gets captured or retained inside of the hatch. So this is a management consideration that we could have, especially over the summer. Try to face the main entrance of the hatch against the predominant wind direction. And for this, we are going to need data. So this comes back to the publicly available sources of data. And wind direction is one of those variables that you can find in those websites. Then for heat transfer radiation, as I said, is important because we know through physics that the incident angle of the sunrise is going to affect the way that energy is concentrated and also dissipated in a surface. When the sun hit the wall of the hatch in a higher incident angle close to perpendicular, we know that energy gets more concentrated. And this uh, ties into our research on the hottest period of the day, because we also know that the higher incident angle of the sun is within this time gap. So this makes more important the way we provide, for example, shade to the hatches, I mean outside shade, so that we can reduce that incident angle of the sun. Also, we have studied this, and when the angle of the sunrise gets more horizontal, there is greater energy spread and less heating. And this again is important for strategic shading, because we also want some sun to be heating to the hatches, but we can be more strategic knowing when the highest level of solar radiation is. And with the data we had collected from the field, we know that the higher solar radiation happens between noon and 4 p.m. So important to consider if we want to provide some shade to the hatches. Now, moving on the animal level measurements of thermal stress, we and other people have used behavior and comfort outcomes, also physiology, and lately microbiome is starting to be used as an animal level measurements. And talking about behavior, shade-seeking behavior has been documented, and we know that calves change this behavior when they get exposed to more heat stress condition. Also, some people have done studies looking at the lying time and lying bouts, and this is important because we know that young calves spend probably 90% of their time lying down. Eating behavior is also important, and there are ways to measure this through some other sensor technology. Physiology is important, of course, clinical observation and dehydration that could be harder to measure in a big scale. Respiratory and heart rates have been described as well, also hard to measure in a big scale. Rectal temperature is affected by the thermal stress condition. We have particularly been interested in using saliva cortisol, and I'm going to show you some data about that. Microbiome as a marker of heat stress exposure could be considered, and also transcriptomics to see what are the biological pathways that are affected by certain environmental conditions. So now, wrapping up, farm level conditions determine the thermal stress conditions, and animal level determine the thermal stress responses. So studying thermal stress is important because it's an energy issue, because we know that animals spend energy to maintain their core body temperature. And whenever the thermal stress conditions overpass certain level, animals need to allocate energy to regulate this core body temperature, and other needs of energy do not get enough energy, so that they get impaired. For example, the immune system may be neglected in terms of energy. So now moving on to heat stress, I'm just gonna share with you some very general conclusion. We have observed that when the THI in the environment exceeds 72 units, calves tend to increase their shade-seeking behavior independent of the hatch temperature. So this means that even though the hatch could be really hot inside, calves still prefer to look for shade. So this is really important because we could consider providing some non-enclosed shade so that they can be there and lay down. Also, some other studies have found that high temperatures increase the laying bouts and reduce the laying time, and this can have considerations in animal welfare, and probably is going to affect the feed intake of these calves. Also, talking about THI, we have observed the same animals being exposed to thermoneutral conditions, so below 70 THI units, and then the same animals above 70 units, and we have taken rectal temperature measurements, and we observed that the same animals, when they are exposed to heat stress condition, their rectal temperature increased by almost 1 degree. Also, other studies have shown us that not providing shade affects the respiratory and the heart rate of these animals. And if we consider respiratory rate and heart rate as a measurement of heat stress, for sure these animals are being affected. But now the challenge is to see how these conditions are going to affect these animals in the long term. So that's why it's so important to consider the duration, frequency, and accumulation of heat stress conditions. Also, for us, it's important to look at which are the periods within the pre-weaning period that are more important in terms of risk of disease. And it seems like the first 2 days of life are an important period that are going to determine if they develop disease later on the pre-weaning period. In the case of a dry climate, we have seen that calf exposed to either heat stress or cold stress conditions within the first 2 days of life develop disease sooner than other that did not were exposed to these conditions during the first 2 days of life. So this could have a management consideration. Maybe we could keep a calf longer in maternity when the temperatures are being too extreme. The previous plot was about scars, and the same ideas I was describing are true for respiratory disease. Also, we have observed that the change between maximum and minimum THI are important. We have observed that within the first days of life, if calf gets exposed to wide ranges of maximum and minimum THI, that increases the incidence of disease and also reduces the age of diagnosis of respiratory disease. So it's important to consider THI not only as a single value, but also how THI and temperature and humidity move even within the same day or within a period of time, especially in early life. So now moving on heat stress physiology, it's important to find ways to measure transient effect of heat stress beyond clinical observations to see if an individual event of heat or cold stress can affect in the longer term the calf performance. So in this regard, we have been using saliva cortisone and cortisol because we can take repeated measure from the animals that are being exposed to thermoneutral and heat stress conditions. So it's kind of a crossover design. And we think that saliva cortisol and cortisone is important because it's a non-invasive technique and it's fairly simple to take. So for the data I am about to show you, we had a 3 observation period. We collected data from 5 to 7 a.m. and we considered this the thermoneutral period. And then we had 2 extra collection points between 10 and noon and between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. And these 2 were considered heat stress conditions. We collected this data in 2 separate days. These days are described here in terms of THI, and it's important to consider that July 17 was less hot compared to July 25th. And also it's important to consider that July 24 was way hotter than July 16. So the levels of heat stress on the previous days of sampling was also different. So in terms of cortisol, first of all, we concluded that cortisol can be detected with our methodology, and we observed kind of a circadian rhythm in the level of saliva cortisol. In the thermoneutral conditions, cortisol tended to be higher in July 25, which was a hotter day, but was not statistically higher in July 17, even though we observed kind of the same pattern of cortisol moving throughout the day. I was surprised to see this cortisol being down here in the conditions that were determined to be heat stress, but we know that cortisol takes about 4 hours to being clear or either to reach peaks in the blood and of course in the saliva. So this may explain why we observe this drop here, because this cortisol may come from previous exposure to other stressful conditions. And also here, before we took the samples, the animals had not been fed, so that may have contributed to the cortisol level. So, but big picture, we consider cortisol as a good way to measure dynamics of stress. Also, cortisol is important because it's a precursor of cortisol, and it has the advantage that it's not as degraded as saliva cortisol, because cortisol gets binded to some other proteins and it's hard to measure. So cortisol could be a good proxy, and literature say that it's highly correlated to plasma cortisol. And about cortisol, we observe kind of the same patterns. So knowing that cortisol is a response to stress, we would like to know if there are specific characteristic in the animals that define different responses. And we believe that, of course, genetics could play a role, but also proteins. because it could tell us which genes or biological pathways are being activated by a stressful conditions, so that in that regards we are using proteomics as an animal response. Talking about assessing some strategies to reduce the heat inside of the hatches. Some years ago, we evaluated the effect of reflective covers that were developed to reflect the sunlight. And we observed that this works in terms of reducing the temperature of the wall of the hatch, but not the temperature in the center of the hatch. And now we know more about thermodynamics, and we believe that this may happen because, of course, we are blocking some of the ventilation, but also we have a layer of air between the cover and the wall of the hatch that could be affecting the convection of the air and, of course, ventilation. So lastly, I have some hutch housing design opportunities, and this come from all the data we have been collecting and all the things we have been learning about challenges. We know ventilation is a challenge. The convection is not so great in the current hatches. I see very often that producers are cutting holes in the hatches just because they think, and I also think could improve the ventilation inside of the hatch. And the basic of this is just because we are increasing the area on which the air can circulate. So if we take this idea, we could also come up with new designs. Also, heat transfer has to do with this complex geometry, so we could improve that as well. Air quality is something we are going to be looking at, especially in ammonia concentrations inside of the hatch. Of course, if we develop a new hatch, it has to be cost effective, it has to be durable. So with that, I would like to thank our undergrads and grad students, especially Amanda, who is doing a master DVM program. She is our CAF guru right now, taking all the data. Also, I would like to thank the Colorado State University Analytical Resource Corps, especially Dr. Gustavo Diaz. They have an amazing set of analytical tools available. Also to the data producers that have allowed us to conduct research, and also DataMax for their support and funding as well. So with that, Cora, I'll be happy to entertain any questions. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A and we will get to those. With the weather being the way it is now, as we're getting into the colder season, what are some things that you, whether it's through experience or through research, best practices you really encourage folks, or certain things you want folks to keep in mind going into the colder months of, this is optimal for calf care, for calves retaining heat, creating their own heat, all of that.
You know how difficult the work is in the field, So I cannot just say, oh, keep an eye on the water or just do this and this and this because,
Mm-hmm.
water gets frozen. So probably you need a consideration on that. Bedding management is important to see when you want to switch from sand to straw if you are using that.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping an eye how wet the straw is, because that's gonna, if it is too wet, it's gonna just create block of ice
Mm-hmm.
for the calf, so that's gonna affect calf comfort. Uh, we have observed some benefits of pair housing in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
You have two bodies there
Yeah.
generating heat. Uh, Also, keep an eye on the wind direction to decide how you wanna locate your hatch lines. In this
Mm-hmm.
case, it's tricky because you also want ventilation. even over the winter. So if you block too much the wind direction, you're going to have other problems. So it's just thinking about uh, trade-off.
Hmm.
But I would say things easier to do is keeping an eye in bedding management when calf need more straw on top or maybe replace the straw.
Hmm.
So that's gonna for sure improve hatch microenvironment.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I've from personal experience, but also what I've seen used out in the field is um when it comes to like really young calves, some folks have, and they know either there's going to be a lot of wind or there's going to be a storm coming in or even just fresh fallen snow. Um, there's like these barrier doors that you can
mhm,
latch onto like the side hooks of a hutch or onto a gate and onto the metal panel. And so that blocks off the front of the hutch. And so we've seen that be beneficial just for really controlling
mhm.
weather in those extreme environments. And then it's just like a door. You can unhook it,
Yeah,
throw it open, and
yeah.
they're very durable and they work well with the hutches and how they're designed. So I've seen
Mhm.
that. And a big thing too for just like winter weather considerations is just maintaining the heat of the milk that is being fed,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it can get cold so
mhm,
fast. And
yeah,
so whether it's whatever method of
yeah,
delivery, some insulation to
yeah,
maintain heat, or if there's a way you can keep that going
yeah.
and warm, that's a big piece to it.
That's an important point. Even you don't have to have the same feeding strategy over the summer and over the
Hmm.
winter. Maybe you can modify the schedule, doing small batches of
Hmm.
bottle, things like that. I also thought about because of our data, we know that the first 2 days of life, the conditions that they get exposed are going to be determinant of their performance later. So maybe decided to keep when it's too extreme, keep newborns time longer in the maternity, maybe
Mm.
when they are 48 days old, and then go to the calf. Caviar could be beneficial because we have observed that calf being exposed to extreme conditions during the first 2 days of life tend to get sick quicker and
Right.
have more events of disease. And that's something you could just change with management.
There's a question that came in. What do you think about splitting the number of milk feedings on hot days? I've noticed that calves often reduce their intake.
It has, well, I have not seen that personally. I think that could be even beneficial to keep the same temperature, in the milk, but it's gonna be matter of if we collect data to see if that really
Hmm.
impacts. Because personally, I think that could be easier to assure they get the same quality of milk every time. Because
Hmm.
after a load of bottles gets out, some bottles can be 40, 50 minutes on the trailer before to
Right.
to get delivered to the calf. So I'm not saying that what that person is saying is wrong. It's just I have not seen that personally,
Hmm.
but it's something interesting to be studied.
This is me speculating, but I wonder with the splitting up of the feedings, say if you go from two feedings to three feedings, it's certainly an adjustment on the calf schedule, but then also there's the potential where if you bring a feeding, say at the hottest time of the day,
Mhm.
you're asking a calf to drink milk during the hottest time
Oh,
of the day. So that
oh
that
yeah.
might be where that difference is possibly being seen. And so I've seen
Okay.
folks adjust the schedule on, say, and this is also for on the employee side too, where they
Mhm.
don't want
Mhm.
to like have their
Yeah.
employees
Okay.
have heat stress, and so they
Okay.
may feed earlier
Yeah.
in the cooler times and potentially give more,
Okay.
or they do that. So I wonder if that was
Yeah.
with that split
Totally.
feeding. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I misunderstood the question. They want to split the same. load of feeding, you know. But yeah,
Yeah.
in that term, absolutely. And that has to do with our research in what are the hottest period of the day.
Hmm.
And if we know, and again, this could vary across different areas of the country. So
Right.
don't take this consideration for New York or Florida.
Right.
Uh, Maybe if we know that it hottest within this period, maybe we can do either two or three or feed younger animals avoiding this period of the day. And
Hmm.
the point you made, Cora, about worker comfort and safety, it's also super
Hmm.
important, you know, because you know what it feels to be
Oh yeah.
outside in the summer and in the winter too. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
the intake decreases for
Right.
that. Yeah, yeah. We don't need much scientific data for that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
really important to evaluate what kind of electrolyte is being
Yes.
used and to make sure it's suitable for the calf. Some folks may also put probiotics into the milk itself just as
Hmm.
an additional immunity
Yeah,
support during these challenging times. So
yeah.
there are options for
Hmm.
still provide some sort
Yeah,
of additional hydration
yeah.
option.
And about that additional hydration, you could perfectly provide this a few hours before the hottest period of the day. That's also gonna have
Hmm.
an impact. So it's not exactly needed to go like at 2 p.m. and provide electrolytes. You could get the calf ready for that
Yep.
extreme event. And I would like to connect there why it's so important to get familiar with the sources of data, because you can understand how your area is
Hmm.
historically, but now it's more difficult with climate change. But at least keep an eye on how temperature have been moving and get ready
Hmm.
for that. Because it's like when you do exercise, like if you are gonna run a marathon, you know you need to have a good hydration the
Hmm.
7 days before running a marathon.
Right.
So probably you could provide this electrolyte. If you know a heat wave is coming, you
Hmm.
could add those electrolytes the days before.
Right, right.
Yeah,
And getting calves familiar with consuming water. And
exactly.
honestly, the electrolytes make it
Yeah,
more palatable for the calves because they're
yeah.
used to milk if they're not used to drinking water regularly. As we know, it takes a bit for those calves to get used to and want to drink water. And especially when you're, say, going from bottle to bucket, or if everything is
Mhm.
on bottle, then they're very used to seeing that bottle and nipple. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
providing that just especially before a heat wave, but
Mhm.
even directly right after feeding of milk, those calves
Yeah,
still want to go for that
yeah,
bottle. And so
exactly.
that's where it's the perfect time to start getting them associated with the
Hmm.
water and
Yeah,
electrolytes just to get them going on it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the main takeaway, we know that climate is gonna be hotter. So try to think on a plan, you know,
Hmm.
response plan, because to some extent we can predict when those extreme events are coming in terms of temperature. So yeah, maybe, you know, developing how's gonna be our feeding strategy when we're facing a heat wave. How are we gonna split feeding times? How are we gonna provide electrolytes? How are we gonna manage bedding? You know, all of that
Hmm.
can be thought ahead, you
Right.
know?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We did have another question come in. Does using foggers help at peak heat periods?
Um, I don't have data to see that, but on top of my head, it could improve um, calf comfort, but also it could improve or affect the humidity
Yeah.
inside of the hatch, and we know that that is not the best thing to have inside of the hatches. And also, if the coat of the calves are wet, the heat convection
Hmm.
uh, or evaporation is gonna be reduced a little bit. So, and we have to have trade-off. I mean, how complicated that's going to be in terms of management. So
Hmm.
for me, the best
I could see that being
management,
practical in, say, like a freestall bed pack setting where there's like
exactly,
over a feed alley. I see that being
exactly.
practical.
Yes, in hatches, I don't know, I don't want to discard it, but it could be harder.
Right.
To me, the best thing to do in line of hatches is to think about the shade.
Yep.
Yeah, and we don't know, we don't need to put shade or cover the whole calf yard. If we understand how the sun moves,
Hmm.
we can provide some shade.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our final session today. It's been an honor to host these for you all, and please reach out to me if you have any future topics you'd love to hear about. And with that, Diego, do you have any final words?
Just thanks everyone, and if you have any question, also feel free to email me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. And the link is here for the survey, and that should also be in the chat. So please fill that out when you have time. And once again, have a great rest of your day, everyone.